At 14:30 on October 4, 1941, near the town of Mtsensk, Oberleutnant Hans von Grobel peered through his gun sight. 600 meters away, on the muddy road to Oriol, was his target. It looked like nothing he had ever seen. Grobel was in command of a Panzer III Ausf. G, the mainstay of Heinz Guderian's armored force. Its 50mm cannon was a superb weapon, tuned to kill the T-26 and BT-7 tanks the Russians had been throwing at them all summer. His gunnery crew was veteran, calm, and lethal. Target sighted. Fire, Grobel ordered. The Panzer shuddered as the PZGR-39 armor-piercing, capped, ballistic-capped shell fired, ripping through the air at over 600 meters per second. It was a perfect shot. The crew watched the tracer strike the enemy tank's frontal plate. And then the impossible happened. The shell did not penetrate. It ricocheted. A yellow-white flash of sparks exploded on the armor, and the shell, its kinetic energy denied, was flung harmlessly into the sky, whistling like an angry cat. The Russian tank didn't even slow down. "Reload," shouted Grobel, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hit him again." The loader slammed another round into the breech. "Ready. Fire." Another crack. Another tracer. Another direct hit. And another sickening, sliding ricochet. 500 meters. The Russian tank was now close enough that Grobel could see its strange, angular shape. Its frontal plate wasn't vertical, like any civilized tank. It was sloped back at a sharp, almost lazy angle. The tank surged forward, unfazed, picking up speed. "All-merciful God, what is that thing?" murmured his driver. The Russian tank, now at 400 meters, fired on the move. A zap sound whipped past Grobel's turret. Its velocity was much higher than his own cannons. The Russian shell hit his squadmate's Panzer III, 50 meters to his right. The explosion wasn't normal. The 76mm shell hit the Panzer's 50mm frontal armor and went clean through it as if it were butter, exiting out the back of the engine compartment. The tank erupted in an instantaneous fireball. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped Grobel's crew. They weren't in a fight, they were being hunted. "Back up! Back up! Reverse!" Grobel screamed. His Panzer III began to move backward clumsily, its 50mm gun now as useless as a cardboard tube. This scene was the culmination of Panzerschock, the Panzer Panic. It was the first time Hitler's victorious and arrogant armies had encountered the T-34. And it was the result of the most spectacular failure of German military intelligence in the war. To understand why this tank existed, and why the Germans were panicking, we must go back to 1937, to the heart of Stalin's darkest purges. The Soviet Union had the largest tank force in the world. But it was a disaster. Its main battle tanks were the T-26 and the BT, Fast Tank, series. The T-26 was a copy of a British design, slow, with paper-thin armor, 15mm, that could barely stop a heavy machine gun. The BT-7 was fast on the road, but its 20mm armor was equally pathetic. Both tanks had proven to be death traps in the Spanish Civil War, easily destroyed by small German anti-tank guns. The Red Army was preparing to fight World War II with the equipment of World War I. Doctrine was stagnant. The field marshal overseeing the tank program, Grigory Kulik, was an old guard bureaucrat who still believed in machine gun-only tanks and horse-drawn artillery. Worse yet, Stalin had just initiated the Great Terror. Any engineer who proposed an idea that was radical or too expensive wasn't just rejected, he was arrested, accused of being a wrecker, and executed with a bullet to the back of the head. The chief designer of the Kharkov tank factory, Afanasy Fursov, had just been taken by the NKVD, the secret police. His crime was spending too much money on new engines. He was shot. In a terrified factory, leaderless and forced to build obsolete tanks for a murderous regime, the Soviet tank program was on the verge of collapse. Fursov's job was given to his obscure, unknown deputy, a 40-year-old engineer named Mikhail Koshkin. And he knew that Stalin's solution would get him killed, but Hitler's solution would kill him first. In 1937, the Soviet Union wasn't just a tank power, it was the tank power. The Red Army possessed over 10,000 armored vehicles, more than the rest of the world combined. In Red Square parades, endless columns of BT-7 and T-26 tanks roared over the cobblestones, an overwhelming demonstration of industrial might. But it was a farce. An army of armored cardboard. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, was the laboratory that exposed the lie. The USSR sent hundreds of its best T-26 and BT-5 tanks to support the Republicans. For the first time, they faced their German counterparts, the Panzer I, and Hitler's newest anti-tank gun, the 37mm Pak-36. The results were a strategic disaster that shook the Kremlin. Quantifying the failure, the raw statistics. The problem wasn't Soviet firepower, the T-26's 45mm cannon was excellent. The problem was that they were made of paper. The T-26's armor, at its thickest, the turret armor was 15mm. The hull armor was 15mm. It was vertical, riveted, and could barely stop heavy machine gun fire. The BT-7's armor, the fast tank, was even worse. Its maximum armor was 22mm on the hull and 15mm on the turret. To save weight and gain speed, it was terrifyingly thin. The threat, the Pak-36, the new German 37mm anti-tank gun, was small, easy to hide, and fired a tungsten steel armor-piercing shell at a velocity of 760 meters per second. Against the 15mm vertical armor of the T-26, the Pak-36 could penetrate and kill the crew from a distance of 1,000 meters, well beyond the tank's accurate return fire range. The pattern of failure. The pattern of combat in Spain became a series of predictable executions. A squadron of Republican T-26 tanks advances to support infantry, their vertical armor plates glinting in the sun. Hidden behind a stone wall or in an olive grove 800 meters away, a calm, professional German Condor Legion gun crew swivels their Pak-36. The gun fires with a sharp crack. The 37mm projectile, the size of a fist, strikes the T-26's 15mm frontal plate. It does not ricochet. It punches through the rivets, spraying flaming metal fragments, spalling, throughout the crew compartment, often hitting the gasoline engine. The tank doesn't stop, it explodes. Soviet reports from the battlefield were filled with panic. The T-26 and BT tanks, both gasoline-powered, earned a terrible nickname from the soldiers: Spichka, matchbox, or Zazygalka, lighter. The brutal statistic was this: hundreds of tanks were lost. More than 60% of the Soviet tank crews sent to Spain were killed or wounded. The report sent to Moscow by General Dmitry Pavlov, the chief Soviet tank advisor in Spain, were clear: the USSR's 10,000-unit tank fleet was totally obsolete. It could not survive on a modern battlefield. The official, and flawed, solutions, the reaction from the Soviet Armored Directorate, GABTU, led by old guard bureaucrats like Marshal Grigory Kulik, was a disaster of committee think. The thicker solution, the first solution, was to simply add more armor. They took the BT-7 design and bolted on more steel plates, creating the BT-7M prototype. But the armor was still vertical. This just made the tank slower, overloaded the engine, and meant a Pak-36 simply needed to get within 600 meters, instead of 1,000, to kill it. The monster solution, the other school of thought, beloved by the cavalry traditionalists, was the land battlecruiser. The result was the T-35, the official heavy tank of the Soviet Union. It was the monster of the Red Square parades. It had 5 turrets, looked like a warship, and was one of the worst tanks ever made. It was so mechanically unreliable that most broke down before even reaching combat. Its armor, while seemingly thick, 30mm, was still vertical and easily penetrated by larger guns. It was slow, gigantic, and a death trap for its 11-man crew. The Red Army was trapped. Its official doctrine was failing. Its official solutions were complex, expensive, and didn't solve the fundamental problem. An armor-piercing shell will always beat a vertical steel plate if you simply make it thicker, and it was in this environment that Mikhail Koshkin took command of the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, KHPZ. The pressure wasn't just coming from Germany, it was coming from within. Koshkin's predecessor, Afanasy Fursov, had just been arrested by the NKVD and shot. His crime? He was accused of sabotage for spending too much state money on engine research and development. Koshkin knew that if he followed the official order and built the improved BT-7M tanks, he would be building lighters for Hitler's next army. But if he proposed something radically different, radically expensive, he would be labeled a saboteur, just like Fursov. He would be shot. He was trapped between the Wehrmacht and the firing squad. The man who inherited the failing Soviet tank program in December 1937 was not a titan of industry or an engineering genius. He was Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin. At 40, he was the new and terrified chief engineer of the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, KHPZ. And he had a secret: he was not, by any stretch, a tank man. His appointment was an accident of history, a product of Stalin's death machine. His predecessor, the brilliant engine designer Afanasy Fursov, had just been arrested at the height of the Great Terror. His sentence for sabotage, spending too much on diesel engine research, was a bullet to the back of the head. Koshkin, his quiet and unassuming deputy, was suddenly promoted to fill the dead man's vacancy. He wasn't the first choice, he was the last man left, and his background made him the world's most unlikely candidate to design the most important weapon of World War II. Mikhail Koshkin was not born into engineering. Born in 1898 to a poor peasant family, his father died when he was a child. He had to work to survive. At 14, he moved to Moscow and found work. His first profession, the experience that shaped his young mind, was not in a steel foundry or a machine shop. He was an apprentice baker in a luxury confectionery. This was his first secret qualification. Koshkin was a conditor. A confectioner, while other engineers of his generation were learning to think in terms of brute force, riveted plates, and massive steel I-beams, Koshkin spent his adolescence working with caramel, sugar, and chocolate. He didn't learn to forge, he learned to mold. He learned how complex shapes and elegant curves could create structures that were both light and strong. He wasn't a brute force engine man, he was, by training, a structural artist. He understood, in a way his peers did not, that shape was a kind of strength. His second qualification came from politics. When the Russian Revolution erupted, Koshkin joined the Red Army and fought in the Civil War. He was not a famous hero, but he was a loyal soldier and became a dedicated member of the Communist Party. And in the early Soviet Union, that was more important than any diploma. The party saw in him a loyal but uneducated man and decided to create him. They plucked Koshkin from his working-class life and, in 1929, sent him to the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute. He didn't choose engineering. Engineering was forced upon him by the party. This was his second secret qualification. He was a completely trustworthy party man. This qualification was purely about survival. Koshkin was not a reckless genius like many of his contemporaries. He was a political survivor. During his studies, he was placed in the famed Kirov factory, where he worked directly under Sergei Kirov, the charismatic leader of Leningrad. In 1934, Kirov was assassinated in his office, an event Stalin used to unleash the Great Terror. Koshkin watched, firsthand, as the system devoured its own. He learned a vital lesson that his predecessor, Fursov, had not. In Stalin's USSR, a good idea could get you killed just as fast as a bad one. If your idea seemed too radical, too expensive, or too Western, it would be labeled sabotage. Innovation was treason. When Koshkin took control of KHPZ in 1937, he was the perfect, singularly qualified man for the job, for reasons no one else understood. He was a man who knew his current tanks, the BT-7, were useless death traps, a fact proven by the reports from Spain. He knew his customer, the Armored Directorate, GABTU, led by Marshal Kulik, was demanding a stupid, official solution, a slightly upgraded BT tank that kept the same fatal flaws. And he knew his real boss, the NKVD, secret police, would kill him if he disobeyed. He was the one man who possessed the three secret qualifications needed to build the T-34, the confectioner's mind, an instinctual understanding of shape and angles, which led him to reject the brute force of vertical armor and embrace the elegance of sloped armor, the party man's loyalty. He was politically clean, a true believer who could be, relatively, trusted by the regime, the survivor's cunning. He knew he could not propose his radical idea openly. He would have to lie, cheat, and disguise his revolution as a simple evolution. Koshkin wasn't a screaming rebel. He was a quiet hacker. He looked at the impossible, contradictory orders from the GAB-2 and found a loophole. They wanted a new BT prototype, the A-20, which was complex and useless. Koshkin agreed to build it. But, at the same time, he started a secret, unauthorized, side project, funded with funds siphoned from the main project. He called it Object 100, or A-32. This secret tank would be his real solution. And it would be based on a single, beautiful idea that had come to him while looking at the reports from Spain. Mikhail Koshkin, the new and terrified head of the KHPZ factory, did not have a single aha moment. He had a moment of claustrophobic panic. He was trapped in a dead end with three walls, the German wall. The reports from the Spanish Civil War were on his desk. They were a statistics book that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the enemy's 37mm PaK-36 could destroy his entire production line of BT-7 tanks like they were tin cans. German technology was superior. The bureaucratic wall, the orders from the Armor Directorate, GAB-2, in Moscow, signed by Marshal Kulik, were on top of the reports. They demanded the official solution, the A-20, a successor to the BT-7. It was a complex, flawed design, insisting on a wheel-track system, the ability to drive on roads without its tracks, which made it a mechanical nightmare and limited its armor. The NKVD wall, his predecessor, Fursov, had just been shot. The smell of gunpowder and fear still hung in the factory's corridors. His crime? Spending too much money on engine R&D, research and development. Koshkin knew that if he obeyed orders and built the official 20, he would be preparing the Red Army for annihilation. But if he openly disobeyed and proposed a radical, expensive tank, the NKVD would arrest him for sabotage and he would be shot. Just like Fursov, his inspiration didn't come from an engineering diagram. It came from a lifetime of surviving bureaucracy. His was a stroke of political and bureaucratic genius that he couldn't reject the order. But maybe he could hack it. The scene of inspiration was in a grim meeting with his design team. The order was clear: build the A-20 prototype. Koshkin agreed. But then, he made the move that would change the world. He invoked the spirit of socialist competition and used his party survivor cunning. We will build the A-20, he told his team. It will be the best A-20 anyone has ever seen. But, as a factory initiative, as a project of revolutionary zeal, we will build a second prototype. A side project. A plan B, so to speak. The A-20 is for wheels. This one, we will call it A-32. Will be for tracks only. We will remove all the useless complexity of the wheels, and the weight we save, we will use for something else. That something else was his true innovation, the theory and physics, the genius of sloped armor. Koshkin did not invent the idea of sloping armor. Engineers had known the concept for years. The American designer J. Walter Christie, whose work led to the BT-7, used it. But Koshkin was the first to understand and apply its revolutionary physics in a radical way. To his fellow engineers, armor was a question of mass. Their solution to the PaK-36 was to add more steel. If a 37mm shell penetrates 30mm of vertical steel, then the solution is simple: use 40mm of vertical steel. But this added immense weight, made the tank slower, and eventually, the enemy would just build a 50mm gun. It was a brute force arms race. To Koshkin, the confectioner, who understood shapes, armor was a question of geometry. His team took a steel plate that was 45mm thick. If they mounted it vertically, like on a German Panzer or a BT tank, an enemy cannon firing at it would have to penetrate exactly 45mm of steel, but Koshkin did something different. He tilted that same 45mm plate backward, at 60 degrees from the vertical. This single act of geometry fundamentally changed the physics of combat, creating two revolutionary advantages. 1. The miracle of effective thickness, trigonometry. Koshkin knew that a tank shell doesn't care about the actual thickness of the plate. It only cares about how much steel it has to travel through along its line of trajectory. when the 45mm plate is sloped at 60 degrees, a shell approaching horizontally, along the line of sight, or LOS, no longer travels 45mm to get through it. The math, a basic cosine function, is $effective thickness equals real thickness / cos, / text, angle of inclination, $45 / text, / text, cos, 60 caret, / circ, equals 45 / text, / 0.5 equals 90 / text, By simply tilting the plate, Koshkin had doubled his armor protection. His tank with 45mm of steel had the same resistance to penetration as a tank with 90mm of vertical steel. He had just created a heavy tank with the weight of a medium tank. He didn't need to add more weight, he just molded the caramel differently. This weight saving was crucial, allowing him to maintain the high speed of the Christie suspension system. Point 2. The magic of Ricochet, normalization defeat, this was what caused the Panzer panic. Increasing effective thickness was genius, but the real magic happened at the physics of impact level, vertical impact, when a German armor-piercing shell, like the PZGR-39, hits a vertical plate, 100% of its kinetic energy, $K, is focused perpendicularly onto the plate. The shell's tip bites into the steel and tries to punch through with brute force, sloped impact. When that same shell hits Koshkin's plate, sloped at 60 degrees, the physics of impact change catastrophically. For the shell, the impact force is split into two vectors, a much reduced, normal, force, perpendicular to the plate, and a very high, tangential, force, parallel to the plate. Instead of biting, the sloped plate acts like a ramp or a wedge. It actively deflects the shell. The tangential impact applies massive shear stress to the shell's tip, which it was not designed to handle. The hardened penetration cap of the German shell would simply shatter or break on impact. The shell, now unstable and without its tip, would just tumble and slide or ricochet harmlessly off the plate, regardless of its thickness. The sloped armor wasn't just stopping the shell, it was using the shell's own energy and design against it to break it. This was why Grobel's Panzer gunners, firing perfectly good shells, just saw sparks. Their ammunition was physically failing at the tip before penetration could even begin. The prototype, the A-32 and the Holy Trinity, Koshkin combined this revolutionary armor with two other innovations that his predecessor, Fursev, had started and died for: the V-2 diesel engine, the one that got Fursev shot. Koshkin rescued it. The BT-7 tanks were lighters because they used highly flammable gasoline engines. The V-2 was a lightweight, powerful, aluminum diesel engine. Diesel fuel is far less flammable, a penetration rarely caused a catastrophic explosion, and it was incredibly fuel efficient, giving the new tank an operational range the Germans couldn't match. The Christie suspension, he kept the wide tracks and robust spring suspension of the BT-7, allowing this new, much heavier tank, with 90mm of effective protection, to move across Russia's muddy terrain. The Rasputitsa, at an incredible 50 km/h. In field trials at Kubinka in 1939, the official 20 and the side project A-32 were tested side by side. The A-20 was complex and mediocre. The A-32 was a revelation. It was fast, agile, and the test guns couldn't scratch it. Koshkin, the master politician, made his final move. He told the Committee of Generals, including Kulik, that his A-32, with 35mm of sloped armor, had performed so well that he could easily add even more steel. He proposed increasing the armor to 45mm. The committee, stunned by the prototype's performance and now facing the prospect of war with Hitler, finally agreed. They approved this up-armored version of the A-32 for production. The prototype's name was changed. In honor of the year of its conception, 1939, and the dawn of a new era, Koshkin christened it T-34. Mikhail Koshkin had won the first battle. In December 1939, his side project, A-32 prototype, now renamed the T-34, had been officially approved for production by the Defense Committee. But for the Soviet military bureaucracy, an approval on paper was one thing, industrial reality was another. Koshkin's innovation was now a hostage to the very bureaucracy he had tried to bypass. Marshal Grigory Kulik, the powerful and stubborn chief of the Artillery Directorate, despised the T-34. He saw it as an expensive, complex, and unnecessary distraction. Kulik's resistance was not passive. He launched an all-out bureaucratic war to kill the T-34 in the cradle, the bureaucracy and the regulations. Kulik and his faction of Old Guard cavalry generals attacked Koshkin on 3 fronts. Doctrine violated. Kulik insisted that tanks had set roles. Fast, BT tanks, like the BT-7, were for exploitation. Infantry, T-26 tanks were for supporting soldiers. Koshkin's T-34 violated these sacred rules. It was fast like a BT, but armored like a heavy tank, thanks to its sloped armor, and armed with a 76mm gun like artillery. It was a hybrid, a universal tank, and that threatened the entire command structure and doctrine of the Red Army. Production sabotaged. The official no was brutal. Kulik refused to sign the order to cancel production of the obsolete BT-7M at Koshkin's factory. This put Koshkin in a Kafkaesque bind. He had orders to build the T-34, but he was not allowed to stop building the old tank that took up his entire assembly line. T-34 production was strangled, limited to a handful of pre-production models. Technical criticism: the T-34 was new, and like all new equipment, it had problems. The V2 diesel engine was temperamental. The transmission was notoriously difficult and broke. The clutch failed. Kulik and his inspectors seized on these teething problems. They began circulating reports in Moscow that the T-34 was mechanically unreliable and not ready for combat. By early 1940, the T-34 was dying. Koshkin was failing to produce the required numbers, and the reports of failures were piling up. The NKVD, secret police, was watching closely. Koshkin was spending millions of state rubles on a failed project, the exact same crime for which his predecessor, Fursov, had been shot. The air in the Kharkov factory was thick with the smell of failure and fear. The decision, the 2,000-kilometer rebellion. Koshkin knew he was cornered. His written reports and test data were being buried or distorted by Kulik before they could reach Stalin. He could not win this fight through official channels. His innovation wasn't failing technically, it was being murdered politically. That he needed an act of revolutionary theater. He needed to bypass the entire military chain of command. He needed to take his tank directly to the only customer who mattered, Joseph Stalin. His decision was one of the most audacious and desperate acts of insubordination in military history. He wasn't going to send a report. He was going to drive his 2, and only, top-secret T-34 prototypes from his factory in Kharkov, Ukraine, to the Kremlin in Moscow. The consequences of failure. This was not a field test. It was an all-out rebellion. The scale of the risk was heart-stopping. The distance, 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles, to Moscow, and 1,000 kilometers back. The season, March 1940. The worst possible month. The deep winter snows were melting, turning Russia's unpaved roads into the infamous Rasputitsa, an impassable, meter-deep ocean of mud that stopped entire armies. The security risk: he was violating every rule of prototype security. He was going to drive the Soviet Union's most secret weapon through civilian villages, in plain sight, where spies, and there were many, could see it. The mechanical risk: the tanks were prototypes. Their infamous transmissions and clutches would fail. They had not been tested for such a long journey. The political risk: this trip was flagrantly unauthorized. Kulik and the Gapta had not approved it. If, or when, the tanks broke down, Koshkin would have no way to hide the failure. If he failed, if the tanks got hopelessly stuck in the mud, if they were spotted by a foreign attaché, if the engines seized 500 kilometers from Moscow, his fate was sealed. He would be dragged to the NKVD headquarters at Lubyanka. He would be charged not with mechanical failure, but with deliberate sabotage. He would be labeled a Trotskyite wrecker, who had destroyed state property and exposed military secrets, all in an effort to embarrass the Red Army. Marshal Kulik would gladly sign his execution order. Koshkin, his confectioner's mind, and his sloped armor would be buried in an unmarked mass grave, and the T-34 would never be built. The accomplice Koshkin, the political survivor, knew he couldn't do this completely alone. He needed a shield. His accomplice was the factory director, Yuri Maksarev. Maksarev was the party bureaucrat who was financially responsible for the factory. Koshkin went to him and explained his desperate plan. Maksarev, in an incredible act of courage, agreed to be the trip's political patron. He used his own party channels, bypassing Kulik and the army, to send a message directly to Stalin's inner circle: Engineer Koshkin is bringing you something that will change the war. He is coming now. With this thin layer of political cover, Koshkin assembled his team. The Kharkov run was on. His life, and the fate of the Soviet Union, now rested on the reliability of two temperamental transmissions in a sea of mud. The surgery was not a last-minute modification. It was the preparation for the most audacious and illegal expedition in Soviet military history. The scene, the vast, cold Kharkov Locomotive Factory, KHPZ, March 5, 1940. The time, 2 o'clock. The air was glacial, cutting like a scalpel. The Russian winter was just beginning to break, and the infamous Rasputitsa, the bottomless sea of mud, was turning the landscape into a quagmire. It was the worst imaginable time for any journey, let alone one in an untested war machine. Mikhail Koshkin, 41 years old but looking a decade older from the relentless stress, stood in the assembly yard. The smell of diesel, cold metal, and fresh paint hung in the air. Before him stood his two illegitimate children, the only two working prototypes of the T-34. His trusted team, a small band of engineers and test drivers who had become co-conspirators, prepared for the act of treason. This expedition was unauthorized. Marshal Kulik and the Armored Directorate, Gabtu, had not approved it. They were, for all intents and purposes, stealing state property worth millions of rubles, in flat violation of procedure. The official papers Koshkin and the factory director, Maksarev, had signed were a transparent lie: local endurance tests. Their planned journey, from Kharkov to Moscow and back, was 2,000 kilometers. The map showed a line, but Koshkin knew the reality would be a nightmare of icy rivers, impassable forests, and waist-deep mud. The tension of the weight was unbearable, because the enemy was not the Wehrmacht, it was their own equipment. The T-34 was a conceptual genius, but mechanically, it was a temperamental infant. Koshkin knew, with crushing certainty, that his innovation would fail during the trip. The transmission and the clutch were its Achilles' heels. They were crude designs, difficult to engage and prone to catastrophic failure under stress. Marshal Kulik knew this. He was counting on it. His report to the NKVD, condemning Koshkin for sabotage, was likely already half-written. The surgery, this night, therefore, was not to modify the tanks. It was to prepare the expedition to survive guaranteed failure. Accompanying the two tanks would be a small support caravan, two heavy Voroshilовets artillery tractors. These trucks were not loaded with ammunition or guns. They were loaded with the strangest expeditionary manifest ever to leave KHPZ: spare parts. This wasn't spare tires and spark plugs. The team had packed two complete T-34 transmissions and multiple clutch assemblies. They were taking an entire tank depot with them. The premise of the trip was not, let's hope it doesn't break, but when it breaks, we must fix it in a muddy field, in under 6 hours, before Kulik's spies find us. Fuel, thousands of liters of diesel fuel, procured by falsifying fuel manifests from other factory projects. The very act of fueling the trip was a capital crime. The human team, Koshkin made his most fateful decision. He was not sending the tanks. He was going with them. The chief engineer, the man who should have been in his design office, was going to risk everything. He brought his deputy, Alexander Morozov, and his best test drivers. They were not soldiers, they were engineers. And they were about to embark on a mission from which there was a very real chance they would not return, not from bullets, but from a show trial. The imminent risk was total. If they were stopped by a local NKVD patrol in the first 100 miles, it would be over. Comrade engineer, where do you think you are going with secret state property? There would be no answer. Worse, there was Koshkin's own health. The man was exhausted, running on 18-hour days for months, under the kind of pressure that had killed his predecessor. He was sick, though he hid it. This trip, driving in unheated vehicles through the frozen mud, would be physically brutal. AT-230, Koshkin gave the signal. The two V2 diesel engines, the innovation Fursev had died for, roared to life with a deep, deafening rumble. The sound was unlike any other tank in the Soviet arsenal, a guttural thunder of power. Mikhail Koshkin, a 41-year-old man who grew up making cakes, climbed into the co-driver's seat of the lead tank. The stench of diesel and hot metal filled his lungs. The hatch slammed shut with a heavy clang, the factory gates opened. The two secret tanks, followed by their support trucks, did not turn toward the local proving ground. They turned north, into the darkness and the mud, toward Moscow. Koshkin was now trapped in his own creation. Every jolt from the Christie suspension, every high-pitched scream from the badly meshed transmission, was a reminder that he was 1,000 kilometers from the Kremlin and only one mechanical breakdown away from the firing squad. Mikhail Koshkin's combat was not against an enemy army. It was against three more relentless adversaries: Field Marshal Grigory Kulik, Mother Nature, and his own fallible creation. The Great March to Moscow, in March 1940, was the clandestine trial. The convoy left Kharkov on March 5. Two top-secret T-34 tanks and two Voroshilov support tractors, disappearing into a pre-dawn snowstorm. For the first 100 kilometers, the team felt like fugitives, looking over their shoulders for NKVD patrols. But then, the real war began. The enemy was the Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian Sea of Mud. But in March, it is worse than mud. It is an ocean of semi-frozen slurry, a treacherous, meter-deep slush covered by a treacherous crust of ice. For a man, it was hell. For a 26-ton machine, it was a gravitational nightmare. The sound inside the steel hull was deafening. It was not the clang of war, it was the scream of engineering pushed to its limit. The V2 diesel engine roared at a high pitch, its exhaust note echoing off the bare birch forests. The wide tracks churned and slammed, cracking dinner plate-sized chunks of ice, as the Christie suspension groaned under the constant strain. The air stank of unburnt diesel, hot steel, and the sweat of men trapped in a confined space. Mikhail Koshkin, coughing and feverish, was in the co-driver's seat of the lead tank. He was not a passenger, he was an engineer collecting data. Every tooth-rattling jolt was a lesson. 450 kilometers in, near the town of Oral, the inevitable happened. Crack grind scrach, the sound of tortured metal echoed inside the lead tank. The test driver screamed, cursing, as he tried to jam it into gear. The lever went dead in his hand. The transmission, the Achilles heel Koshkin had feared, had torn itself apart. The 26-ton tank slowed and ground to a halt, sinking into the icy mud. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. They were stranded. A top-secret tank prototype, broken down and exposed on a public back road, hundreds of kilometers from anywhere. This was the exact scene Marshal Kulik had predicted. It was the end of a career, the firing squad. Koshkin opened the hatch. The icy wind hit him like a punch. He was drenched in a feverish sweat. "Nobody panic," he shouted over the wind to the other tank. "Bring the tractor." This was the true climax. The clandestine surgery had to be performed in the field. The Voroshilov support tractor slid alongside. Instead of gunners, engineers emerged, grabbing pulley blocks and chains. There was no garage. No crane. They were in a frozen swamp. Under Koshkin's feverish direction, the men worked for 14 hours. They used the second T-34 to tow the broken tank to slightly firmer ground. They laid tree trunks in the mud to create a work platform. They had to open the tank's hull, expose its steel guts to the howling wind, and use a manual winch and the brute force of 20 men to hoist the broken, multi-ton transmission out of the tank. Then, they had to hoist the new spare transmission in and install it, aligning gears and shafts with numb, bloody fingers. All the while, Koshkin, the chief engineer, was in the mud with them, alternating between giving orders and being consumed by coughing fits that racked his body. During a river crossing days earlier, the ice had broken. Instead of risking his tanks, Koshkin had jumped into the icy water, chest deep, to find a safe path for his machines to cross. He had saved the tanks. But he had condemned himself. He was now suffering from raging pneumonia. But he kept going. After 2 days of hellish repair and driving, the convoy reached the outskirts of Moscow. The return, the Kremlin, March 17, 1940. The final climax was not in the mud, but on the sacred cobblestones of the Kremlin. The two T-34s, now chronically broken down but stubbornly functional, were cleaned and driven into Ivanovsky Square. The audience was the most intimidating on earth: Joseph Stalin, his right-hand man Vyacheslav Molotov, and their Politburo accomplices. And there, standing beside them, with a sneer on his face, was Koshkin's enemy, Marshal Grigory Kulik. Kulik was there to watch the official failure of Koshkin's project. Koshkin, gray, skeletal, and burning with fever, could barely stand. He gave the order. The immediate reaction, the debriefing. A test driver leaped into the lead T-34. The V-2 engine roared, its diesel sound an unholy thunder in the Tsar's courtyards. Stalin watched, impassive, pipe in hand. The T-34 didn't just move forward. It exploded into motion. The test driver, in an act of pure arrogance and defiance, gunned the tank to 40 km per hour across the cobblestones, toward the Politburo. The generals flinched. 10 meters away, the driver locked the tracks, executing a high-speed, bootleg turn. The 26-ton tank skidded 90 degrees, throwing sparks and bits of cobblestone into the air, stopping perfectly aligned in front of Stalin. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the tank turned and drove up the steps of one of the palace buildings, crushing the masonry, just to prove its climbing ability. The debriefing was instantaneous. Marshal Kulik turned white. His jaw dropped. His official BT-7 tanks couldn't do any of that, they would have broken in half. The reversal, Stalin's verdict. Stalin was not an engineer, but he understood power. He took the pipe from his mouth and walked slowly around the machine. He ran his hand over the 45 mm frontal armor plate, sloped at 60 degrees, Koshkin's central innovation. He rapped his knuckles on the cold steel. He understood the geometry of strength. He turned, not to Koshkin, but to the livid Marshal Kulik. "This," Stalin said, pointing at the tank with his pipe, "is a revolutionary weapon. It is what we will build." The world changed in that instant. The rebellion was over. The innovation had won. Koshkin, the confectioner, had bypassed the entire Soviet military bureaucracy and sold his idea directly to the dictator. Stalin approved immediate, full-scale production of the T-34. Koshkin, barely able to stand but victorious, still had to face the 1,000-kilometer journey back to Kharkov. His mission was complete, but the cost would be absolute. The demonstration in the Kremlin on March 17, 1940, was Mikhail Koshkin's triumph. His had been vindicated. His rebellion had been pardoned. Stalin, the ultimate customer, had signed the order. Koshkin's order, full and immediate production, superseded all others. But now, the protagonist returned to Kharkov to face a logistical nightmare 1,000 times more complex than his 2,000-kilometer journey. It is one thing for a genius and a dedicated team to hand-build 2 boutique prototypes. It is something else entirely to get a Bronze Age locomotive factory, run by terrified bureaucrats, to mass-produce the most advanced weapon on the planet, while the clock to annihilation ticks. The mass adoption of the T-34 was not a smooth transition. It was industrial, political, and human chaos. The first cost of implementation was the protagonist himself. Koshkin's implementation tour was his return journey to Kharkov. The trip was just as brutal as the one there. His pneumonia, contracted in the icy river crossing where he saved his tank, worsened. When he arrived back at the KHPZ factory in April, he was a hero, and a dying man. He did not go to a hospital. He went to his desk. He knew Stalin had protected him from Marshal Kulik, but he also knew Stalin's order was a double-edged sword. If production failed, if the numbers weren't met, the saboteur label would return, and it wouldn't just be him facing the firing squad, it would be his entire design team. The logistical challenge was almost insurmountable. The KHPZ factory was a locomotive plant. Its workers were masters of forging and riveting massive 100mm steel for steam boilers. They were craftsmen of brute force. Koshkin's T-34 was not brute force, it was an engineering sculpture. Logistical challenge 1, the impossible armor. The central innovation, the 45mm sloped armor, was a nightmare for mass production. The Germans built their panzers like boxes, often using interlocked and riveted plates. It was slow, but easy. The T-34 required massive, hardened steel plates to be welded at precise angles. The Soviet Union of 1940 had almost no advanced welding technology. Its welders were crude, used to arc welding soft steel. The first 50 T-34 hulls that came off the production line were, frankly, terrible. The welds were full of air bubbles and impurities. When struck by a shell, even one that didn't penetrate, the welds would crack, and the armor plate would simply fall off. Koshkin and his engineering team, now led by his designated heir, Alexander Morozov, had to invent the production technology while building the assembly line. They pioneered the use of automatic submerged arc welding, a technology developed by Professor Yevgeny Payton in Kiev. This machine could lay a perfect, deep weld far faster than any human. They were, literally, building the future of industrial engineering on the factory floor, while foremen screamed for quotas. Logistical challenge 2, the demanding engine. The second crime for which Fursov had died, the V2 diesel engine. It was a miracle, a 500 horsepower, 12-cylinder engine made almost entirely of aluminum to save weight. KHPZ was not an aircraft engine factory. They didn't cast aluminum, they cast raw iron. The first few hundred V2 engine blocks they tried to cast were a disaster. Over 50% were rejected. They had cracks, weak spots. It was too complex, too delicate. Koshkin had to retool an entire section of his foundry, teaching old iron masters how to handle the new age's light metal. The bureaucracy relents, reluctantly. Stalin had spoken. Marshal Kulik had been humiliated. But he did not disappear. The GAB-2 Armored Directorate bureaucracy launched one last, desperate counterattack. In June 1940, as Koshkin was literally on his deathbed, Kulik and his faction called an emergency meeting in Moscow. Their agenda: to cancel the T-34 entirely. Their argument was clever: the early problems, the bad welds, the faulty engines, the horrific transmissions that still broke, proved the tank was mechanically unreliable and too expensive. Kulik proposed that production focus on his tested and true tank, the obsolete BT-7M. He almost succeeded. It took another furious intervention from Stalin and the Politburo to silence Kulik for good and give the T-34 total, absolute priority. The bureaucracy didn't relent, it was crushed by terror from the top. The protagonist's final implementation tour. Mikhail Koshkin never saw his tank in combat. He never learned of the Panzer panic. He spent the summer of 1940 dying, but he refused to leave the factory. He would be carried from his bed to the shop floor, wrapped in blankets, to oversee the recalibration of a machine tool. His pneumonia had turned to gangrene. In September 1940, as the very first series production T-34s, flawed, crude, but real, rolled off the line, his body finally gave out. Mikhail Koshkin died on September 26, 1940. His official cause of death was pneumonia. His real cause of death was his innovation. He had given his life, not to win a battle, but to win the production race. He had sacrificed himself to ensure his idea, the world-changing sloped armor, got off the drawing board and onto the assembly line. The bottom-up adoption by the enemy. The true mass adoption didn't come from Soviet generals or happy tank crews, who initially hated the broken transmissions. The final, undeniable demand came bottom-up from the enemy. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, Germany invaded. Most of the 1,200 T-34s that had been built were lost, not to combat, but to mechanical breakdown or lack of fuel, a testament to Kulik's fears about reliability. But in a few places, like Mtsensk, they fought. And that is where Panzershock hit General Guderian. His Panzer IIIs, the cream of the Wehrmacht, fired. And they watched their 50mm shells ricochet like ping-pong balls off those impossible sloped plates. It was the German generals who created the demand. It was the panicked reports from Guderian and von Kleist sent to Berlin, we have met a tank we cannot kill. Our technology is inferior. That proved Koshkin right. These reports, intercepted by Soviet intelligence, were the final validation. From that moment on, T-34 production became the sole focus of Soviet industry. As the Germans closed in on Kharkov, the entire factory was disassembled, put on trains, and moved 1,500 kilometers east to the Urals, to a new Tankograd, tank city. There, protected by winter, they built Koshkin's innovation on a scale that defied imagination. The payoff for Mikhail Koshkin's innovation wasn't measured in rubles saved or production bonuses. It was measured in a new word that entered the German lexicon in October 1941, Panzerschock. The Panzer Panic. It was the visceral, terrified reaction of the world's best, most arrogant tank crews as they realized their weapons were suddenly useless. Koshkin's rebellion, his deadly bet on geometry over brute force, was fully vindicated. The before and after, the new raw statistics. Let's revisit the problem from step 2. The before was the disaster in Spain. Soviet tank before, BT-7, with 22 mm of vertical armor. German threat, 37 mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun. Result, 100% penetration at 1,000 meters. A total kill rate. Soviet tanks were lighters, Spichka. Now, the after. October 1941, Battle of Mtsensk. Soviet tank after, T-34, with 45 mm of armor sloped at 60 degrees. Effective thickness, Los 90 mm. How did the German arsenal stack up against Koshkin's innovation? 1. The death of the PaK-36, the door knocker, the Wehrmacht's main anti-tank weapon, the 37 mm PaK-36, was now comically useless. Its shells had been designed to penetrate 30 mm of steel. Against the 90 mm of effective thickness of the T-34, the physics simply wouldn't allow it. At 1,000 meters, 500 meters, 100 meters, the range didn't matter. The result was the same. The 37 mm shell, striking the perfectly angled armor plate, shattered on impact. It didn't ricochet, it disintegrated. German gun crews, once the elite hunters, began abandoning their guns and running when they saw a T-34. Their weapon earned a bitter new nickname, the Hirschenklopfgerät. The Army's door knocker. The T-34 had made Hitler's most numerous anti-tank gun obsolete overnight. 2. The Panzer III panic, the mortality rate, the real Panzerschock came from the Panzer crews. The Panzer III OSF. G, the main German battle tank in 1941, was armed with an excellent 50 mm, KWK-38, cannon. But excellent was relative, it had been designed to fight vertically armored tanks. Against Koshkin's innovation, the math became a death sentence. The T-34, offense at 76 mm F-34 cannon could penetrate the Panzer III's 50 mm vertical frontal armor at 1,500 meters. The Panzer III, defense its 50 mm cannon, using its best armor-piercing round, could not penetrate the T-34's 90 mm sloped frontal armor, at any distance. This created an impossible tactical duel. The T-34 could stop at 1,000 meters, well outside the Germans' effective range, and methodically destroy the panzers one by one. For a panzer gunner, the experience was a nightmare. He would fire. He would see his shell hit the T-34. He would see the flash of a ricochet, the 80% ricochet statistic from the title, and then, seconds later, he would be killed by a 76 mm shell coming the other way. The T-34 wasn't just nullifying enemy shots, it was doing it while dealing death with impunity. The enemy's reaction, the supreme compliment. The most profound, measurable proof of Koshkin's genius didn't come from Soviet generals, but from the panicked reports of his enemies. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg and perhaps the greatest tank commander of all time, was the first witness. After his 4th Panzer Division was decimated by T-34s from a single Soviet brigade at Mtsensk, he sent an emergency report to Berlin. He wrote, "The Russian T-34 tanks are far superior to ours. Their sloped armor is a brilliant solution. Our panzers are inferior. Measures to rectify this situation are urgently needed. The German High Command, shocked at the idea that their Aryan superrace was technologically inferior to the Slavic subhumans, sprang into action. They formed a special commission, the Panzer Commission. In November 1941, they sent their best tank engineers, including men from Porsche and MAN, to the front lines near Tula. Their mission, to examine captured T-34s and figure out why Panzerschock was destroying the Wehrmacht's morale. What they found shocked them. The tank was crude, the welds were ugly, the interior was cramped. But the geometry was perfect. The enemy's reaction was the most famous, bottom-up adoption, in history. Germany realized its thicker vertical armor philosophy, as on their new Tiger I, was an evolutionary dead end. It was too heavy, too slow. The only way to beat the T-34 was to copy it. The result of that copy was the Panzer V Panther. The Panther, which appeared in 1943, is Mikhail Koshkin's measurable legacy. Look at it, wide tracks for the mud, a long high-velocity cannon, and most importantly, a massive 80 mm frontal armor plate sloped at 55 degrees. The Panther is the 45-ton steel proof that Koshkin's theory was correct. German engineering, the best in the world, was forced to abandon its own doctrine and adopt the philosophy of a dead confectioner. The failure of innovation, the T-34 paradox. Yet, the T-34 was a paradox. Koshkin's design was perfect. The initial execution was a disaster, and it's why the Wehrmacht advanced so far in 1941. The transmission failure, just as Koshkin had feared, the transmission was his true enemy. It was so crude that crews had to use a hammer to change gears. Many tanks were abandoned intact by their crews, not because they were penetrated, but because the transmission broke 50 kilometers from the factory. The vision failure, the 1941 model T-34s were blind. The optics were milky and horrible. The turret failure, the greatest flaw was the two-man turret. The tank's commander had to also be the gunner. He was overloaded, trying to find targets, load the cannon, command the driver, and fire the gun. German panzers, with their superior three-man turret, commander, gunner, loader, were tactically far superior. However, this is the final turning point. Koshkin's sloped armor innovation was so overwhelmingly powerful, so revolutionary, that it overcame all these other catastrophic flaws. The T-34 was a mechanically terrible, ergonomically blind, and tactically overworked tank that still dominated the battlefield. Its geometric survivability bought the Red Army time they desperately needed, to fix the mechanical flaws, train new crews, and, eventually, mass-produce the weapon that would win the war. Mikhail Koshkin's demonstration in the Kremlin in March 1940 ensured his innovation's life. But the cost of that victory was his own. The protagonist's fate, the confectioner's sacrifice. Mikhail Koshkin did not live to see Panzerschock. He never knew that Hitler's generals dubbed his creation the deadliest tank in the world. He would never see his T-34s roll into Berlin. His 2,000-kilometer rebellion through the frozen Russian mud had been his greatest triumph and his death sentence. The pneumonia he contracted from jumping into an icy river to save his prototype never left him. He returned to Kharkov not as a conquering hero, but as a gravely ill man. Refusing to stop, Koshkin spent the summer of 1940 working feverishly, sleeping in his office, forcing his reluctant factory to adopt the new welding and aluminum casting methods. He was in a race against Hitler's Wehrmacht and against the infection in his own lungs. The infection won first. In September 1940, less than 6 months after shaking Stalin's hand, Koshkin was rushed into surgery. His lungs were riddled with gangrene. He died on September 26, at the age of 41. Koshkin was the ultimate martyr to his own innovation. He died of pneumonia and exhaustion, a direct sacrifice from his desperate journey to prove he was right. His recognition was almost entirely posthumous, and for decades, silent. He was awarded the Stalin Prize, posthumously, in 1941, but the Soviet regime, which disliked celebrating individuals, quickly buried his story. The T-34 was presented to the world as a product of collective socialist genius, not the vision of a single, rebellious confectioner who had risked execution to bypass the party's marshals. It was only in 1990, as the Soviet Union was crumbling, that Mikhail Gorbachev posthumously named him a hero of socialist labor. His story, like many victims of the purges, was only fully told after the regime he served had vanished. The innovation's fate, the weapon that changed the geometry of war. The fate of Koshkin's creation was the opposite of its creator. It was not silent, it was the loudest sound of the 20th century. The T-34 became the defining weapon of the Second World War. Its production, based on Koshkin's plans, was moved east to Tankograd and became the single greatest industrial feat in history. Over 84,000 T-34s, including its later variant, the T-34-85, were produced. It was the most produced tank in history, the weapon that effectively crushed the Wehrmacht from Kursk to Berlin. But the T-34 itself is not the true legacy. The true legacy is Koshkin's idea. The sloped armor. Koshkin's innovation didn't just win a battle, it closed an entire era of tank design. The vertical box philosophy, Panzer III, Panzer IV, M4 Sherman, Churchill tank, was dead. The Koshkin doctrine and global adoption. After 1941, every main battle tank, MBT, in the world became, fundamentally, a T-34. Koshkin's design became the baseline for the very definition of a tank. The German copy, the Panzer V Panther, was a direct, panicked copy. The German Panzer Commission copied Koshkin's Holy Trinity, sloped armor, wide tracks, and a long, high-velocity cannon. The American evolution, the M4 Sherman, with its box front armor, was a slaughterhouse. Its replacement, the M26 Pershing, looked suspiciously like a T-34, with a heavily sloped hull and turret. The British evolution, their vertical Churchill tanks were a dead end. Their next tank, the Centurion, perhaps the most successful post-war design, was a sloped armor platform. The present, go to any army base today. Look at an American M1 Abrams, a German Leopard 2, or a Russian T-90. What do you see? Sharp angles. Composite armor plates tilted at 60 to 70 degrees to maximize effective thickness and force ricochet. Sloped armor is the legacy. Koshkin's principle of geometry is now a law of physics as fundamental to tank design as wings are to an airplane. He proved that shape was stronger than mass. Cultural memory, the moral of the story. The T-34 itself is Koshkin's monument. Thousands of them sit on pedestals in town squares from Volgograd to Berlin, iron symbols of an almost unimaginable industrial and human sacrifice. The Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow proudly displays T-34s next to their captured enemies, Panzers, Panthers, and Tigers. But the moral of Mikhail Koshkin's story is deeper. It is a story of failing forward where it was the bureaucracy that failed. Marshal Kulik, the chief bureaucrat, was eventually demoted for incompetence. Koshkin, the rebel, was the only one who saw the truth. His story proves that innovation is not a function of committees or doctrine. It is often the result of a single individual, trapped in an impossible dead end, who is willing to risk everything, his career, his reputation, and in Koshkin's case, his own life, not for glory, but because his math was correct. The confectioner from Kharkov, with his understanding of geometry, gave the Red Army a weapon that could ricochet bullets. In the process, he changed the shape of the world.